Joining me now on the Knicks Film School podcast. This is definitely not the first time I've talked to this guest. I'm trying to think if he's been on this show before. I'm sure Andrew will remind me if you have. Either way, it is an absolute pleasure and an honor to have on the man who frequent Knicks Film School guest Fred Katz calls the best beat writer in the business. And he ain't lying, of The Athletic, Jon Krawczynski. How are you, man?
Great to be here, Jonathan. Thanks a lot for that too kind intro, but I will not live up to any of that on this appearance, but I'll do what I can. So
yeah, sure. I love the modesty. So I got to start out. We'll talk about the trade and Cat and all that stuff. But I have to start out with what I think of as now the soccer story. And I know everybody by now has, if they haven't read the story, they've at least heard about the story. And if they haven't, please pause the podcast now, go to theathletic.com and search for Jon's page and go read the soccer story that I'm talking about. You won't regret it. I love the story, but I read it and it was funny because I was about to read Fred's piece and he texted me, "Have you read Jon's story yet?" I'm like, "No, I was going to read it after yours." He's like, "Stop reading my story and read his instead." So I'm reading this and I'm like, all I can think of is how often does a journalist get to be the story, a big part of the story? So my question to you is, when did you realize, like, oh, wait a minute, this is the story. This has to be the story.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, if for people who are familiar with my work, like I joke, but I don't. Like I think my lane in sports journalism is Hallmark cards. Like I really do like to tug at heartstrings. I like to personalize and humanize athletes and coaches that I cover. I think that that's my strength. You know, there are people who are unbelievable X's and O's analysts. There are people who can really dive into the metrics and the analytics and all of those things. And there's value in all of that. And I learn a lot from them. My particular I think area of expertise is trying to turn the two-dimensional athlete that you see on TV into a three-dimensional person. And so, after kind of seeing how a trade of this magnitude does get analyzed and get broken down, you're looking for just what can I do that's unique in this just blizzard of great reporting and great analysis of it. And, I wasn't planning on writing it when he showed up to the game, but I just kept thinking about and seeing the reaction to the trade. And what I wanted to bring to the table was, I don't think that people know Karl-Anthony Towns. Like, I just think that there certainly is a perception about him. You see a lot of kind of jokes being made at his expense, and some of that stuff is well earned. Some of it he brings on himself and things like that. But, at his base level, he has a really good heart. And as I was kind of thinking about ways to really encapsulate his 9 years in Minnesota, that scene just absolutely was, kind of one of the things that I'll just remember, not just that scene, but all of the other little things that he did as a person here to kind of make his impact felt. And he may have fallen short in championships and other things, but I just said to myself, like, I got to let people know the cat that I know, because I've known him, every step of the way that he's been here. So that's what I tried to do.
And you did it in spades. What a story it was. And it really did bring to light what you're talking about, which is Cat the person. And it's funny because, he had the New York connections. And in this, I've said this before, but I'll say it again, in this age where it seems like every major star is trying to push their way out to a coastal city, New York would have been the obvious one for him to push his way towards any number of times. Not only did he not do it, it didn't seem like it was even on his radar. And then when he said things like, "Man, I really want to bring a championship to Minnesota," it seemed like he really meant it. Do you think how much he cared and how much of himself he poured into that team and into that franchise and into that city? This may be an unfair question. Do you think that was like almost made it more difficult for him to be successful there? Or do you think that was ultimately a good thing?
Boy, I haven't thought about it that way. I guess what I would say kind of along those lines is I do think that what Karl-Anthony Towns at his core is someone who wants to be liked and be part of a team and a family atmosphere. And there is kind of that yearning for personal connection with him. And sometimes that works against him. Sometimes he gets too caught up in, what is being said about him, or just the overall atmosphere. There are athletes that walk into a locker room and browbeat people or say, I don't care, this is what we're doing, and come hell or high water, this is it. That's not Karl. Karl wants to be included, but he wants everyone to get along well, and he wants to let everyone know how much he cares about all of this stuff. And so there are times, or there were times here where, he I think was in the crossfire of the Jimmy Butler stuff, or he was kind of getting weirdly criticized for kind of things that he would say on podcasts and stuff. And I think I think that it stings a little bit to kind of have him process that and just say, look, all I've been doing in my 9 years here is trying to rise above any of the petty stuff. I've said it, but he's had 7 general managers and 5 head coaches in the first 7 years of his career. Like, he had the Jimmy Butler nonsense. He had all sorts of things that a million other franchise level players would have said, this is ridiculous. Get me out of here. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. You are failing me. And the Wolves were failing him early on. And instead, what he did was look around and say, this is a unique situation. And if I can be part of a team that turns this thing around and gets it to kind of where they're at right now, and hopefully a step further, then it means more. It means more to have been kind of dragged through the mud and come out on the other side clean. And, I do think that's a little bit of why he is appreciated more now, like, than he was, say, 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah. Is he helped to get the team to a 3-time playoff team, a Western Conference finalist. He had some success in the playoffs. And I think there was a little bit more respect for, this guy really went through some stuff and he never took the easy way out.
It's so funny. I'm hearing you talk and I'm thinking of 2 different ironies. The first, and I'm curious if you've thought of this or how much I'm sure you're aware of it, but the way you just described the change in perception with the fan base with Karl, I think could absolutely apply to Knicks fans with Julius Randle. Obviously, he was not drafted, let alone first overall, not here as long. But if I tell you the outpour, and you've probably seen it, the outpouring of support and appreciation for Julius over the last few weeks, and now, and like hearing you say this about Kat, it's pretty weird. And then the other irony is talking about the organization failing him. Have you thought about the fact that the thing that they finally did to do right by him, which is draft this potentially generational superstar, is that in a weird way the thing that ultimately not pushed their hand, but like it enabled them to make this sort of trade?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things on that. I think one is they finally hired the right general manager in Tim Connolly after missing a lot. They finally drafted the superstar that Karl needed next to him in Anthony Edwards, and credit goes to Gerson Rosas for making that pick. And they have a good, the right coach there as well. They are as stable in the leadership positions outside of ownership. There's a lot going on there, but they are as stable in the main basketball leadership as they've ever been in Karl-Anthony Towns' tenure. And so, yeah, I do think that Anthony Edwards' presence, and they drafted and developed Naz Reid into a really good player. Mm-hmm. Like they've had they've had a lot of success in team building over the last 3 to 5 years that did enable them to kind of pull a trigger on a trade like this where they never could have before. The final element of that obviously is like this new life that we live in, this new collective bargaining agreement, essentially is a hard salary cap that they put on teams. And really, like, there's no reason that Golden State should have had to say goodbye to Klay Thompson, the Clippers, and Paul George, and now you're seeing the Wolves and Karl-Anthony Towns. Like, there's real financial elements of this that play into it that were not present, before this CBA enacted. So there's a lot of details and elements that factor into why now was a feasible time for this organization to do this. Talking about Ant, who I will say out at the outset, Andrew could back me up on this, I'm a
massive fan of. I forget what his current MVP odds are, but like, I don't think it would be the worst bet in the world. Do you think that there was some level of maybe suspicion is the right word as to whether that two-man partnership would ever elevate to the level that typically you see in championship teams between their two best players?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so first of all, I think that from a chemistry standpoint, they were close. They got along well. Karl really accepted this sort of, rocket ship that came into the organization, into his franchise, and ultimately took everything over. And
was that hard for him, do you think?
I think it was probably a little bit hard, but I also think that all of the losing that he endured, I think made him recognize that, hey, I need help here. And I finally have help here. And that's why I do think that Karl and Jaylen Brunson will work very well together, where, Jaylen is so popular there, and Karl will be happy to share the spotlight with him and to be his supporting cast. And that's what Karl did here with Anthony that way. But, when you look at the interesting thing about the pairing so far is like, when the first thing you say is, man, Ant and Cat, two of the most individually offensively talented players in the entire league, but yet as talented as they were 17th in the NBA in offensive efficiency last year. It just wasn't adding up. That now I do believe that they thought if they went into this season that there would be a chance that maybe they kind of found some secret sauce that they hadn't yet, that another year together would have helped them. And so I don't think they didn't make a decision as this is not going to work. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that you might have expected more offensively from this group with two such talented players than they got last year that way.
I'm bouncing around a little bit. I apologize for that. You mentioned Jimmy Butler before, who I wanted to get to, because much has been made of the relationship, obviously, between Karl and Tom Thibodeau. And on a podcast that no longer exists. I remember that's when we talked about this when Tibbs got hired, and we talked about it then. So we don't need to rehash too much, but I'm curious because, like you said, Karl took so much of the blame after that, especially after Jimmy went like on the proactive with the PR tour, I guess if you call it that. How much do you think the Jimmy and Karl Towns relationship impacted the Karl-Anthony Towns, Tom Thibodeau relationship, or is that too much of a stretch?
No, I don't think it's a stretch at all. By the end of the tenure, before just Tibbs was fired, I mean, I think that there was great frustration on Cat's part that Tibbs allowed Jimmy to make a mockery of the entire organization, to make a fool of Cat and Wiggins and everyone else as he waged his personal war to get out of there. He did look at it as, well, I would say that there was a very interesting dichotomy in terms of Tibbs, the coach who preaches team, who preaches egoless basketball, who preaches do your job, clock in and stay together. And yet here is your guy, your main guy, absolutely being as selfish as humanly possible and blowing this whole thing up. I think that was a real problem for Cat. I will say that as things have gone on, the thing that happens a lot of times with Tibbs players is they have their own frustrations with him as a coach as it's happening. And then once they get away from it and look back on it, they think, maybe this is Devil Wears Prada. Maybe they were actually good for me. Maybe he did have, as a strategically a brilliant coach, and his methods might be a little unorthodox, but I understand them more. I think Karl is there now with his maturity and the way that he looks at things. And I think a lot of those feelings are probably, pushed to the side or buried or in the, water under the bridge. I think that's the case, but yeah, during it and as it was happening, I think that you could look at it and say, man, they are putting Karl-Anthony Towns on an island here and just letting him take bullet after bullet.
Now I can't stop thinking about Tom Thibodeau dressing up as Meryl Streep for Halloween, and the podcast has been ruined. So thank you for that. But Karl, he spoke. I forget when the soundbite was from, a couple of years ago, and he said, correct me if I'm wrong, he said, I've forgiven Tom, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to ask you to peer into the mind of Tom Thibodeau, but like, did there need to be, or does there need to be something there on Tom's end to make this like a conversation, or can it be unsaid? Like, what do you think has happened or will need to happen between those two for this to work here, if anything?
Well, I mean, one thing that I really have come to know about Tibbs that I think would surprise people when you watch him on the sideline is doesn't hold grudges. Like, he is not a guy who kind of looks at things that didn't work in the past and then is just like, I'm ostracizing you. I don't believe in you. Like, we're never going to speak, like all of those things. Like, I think that he moves on pretty quickly. And from, talking to people that know both of them well, I think that, from what I understand, Tibbs was very much in favor of the trade and wanted to bring him in. And I think understood that a player of his talent fits exactly with what the Knicks have. And maybe it wasn't a great fit with the Timberwolves and how all of that came together, but this is a much more promising pairing now that you have Tibbs at this stage of his career, you have Cat at that stage of his career. And so I don't anticipate there's going to be some road trip where they sit down and have a meal and open their hearts. I just don't think that that's the case.
Roast marshmallows over the campfire.
I don't think that. But here's the other thing that I like about this situation now for Karl is when Tibbs was here, he was the president of basketball operations and he was the head coach. And anyone who served underneath him was not serving anything besides, we know what Tibbs wants, we're going to do what Tibbs wants. And I think in New York, you have Leon, you have Wes, you have Gerson, you have a bunch of people who just, I think, understand how to set an ecosystem a little bit better than it was here. And so I think there are other people within the organization who might be able to give Cat a little bit more of the personal attention than Tibbs is gonna, give him, because just Tibbs isn't that guy. And I don't think that Cat's super high maintenance and needs a bunch of, warm blankets over him or anything. But I do think that it helps to have lines of communication. And I think that at the end of the Minnesota regime, there just was no communication on going any way, with anyone. And so they're all better off now. Tibbs is better off. Cat will be, 28 years old and he's going in there. And then that organization has a good ecosystem set up to work with Karl-Anthony Towns and make everyone feel comfortable.
Yeah, and another guy we haven't talked about explicitly yet, or you mentioned him actually before, is Jaylen Brunson. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'm going too far. I've said this before that I think this is the greatest opportunity of Jaylen Brunson's career, even more so than getting the starting gig in New York and having this opportunity. But you could also argue the greatest challenge, because you have now this player who has more tools, arguably, than any big man who's ever played the game. And do you, like, how do you envision that partnership? Like, again, knowing Cat, knowing how he interacts with players, how do you envision that partnership maybe working?
Yeah, I mean, I think they complement each other really well. Number one is, like, I don't know Jaylen Brunson. All I've heard is just rave reviews of him as a leader, as a person. So the way that he, I think, runs that locker room is going to be a welcoming environment for Cat to come into. I think that Cat arriving to a team, much like Randall coming to Minnesota and it's Ant's team, like like the roles are going to be set in. I think Cat going there knows it's Jaylen Brunson's team, but I think that he also just at this point of his career wants to have as much team success as possible, because he's heard all of the criticisms of all those numbers that you get and it doesn't impact winning. He impacted winning last year, and I think he wants to do a heck of a lot more of it. And then you just look at their games. I mean, that pick and roll, pick and
saw last night.
Yeah. I mean, Jaylen loves to work the mid range, loves to kind of be crafty in there. Cat can, set and pop and shoot from outside, or even get the roll going that we saw a couple times, which was really nice. I just think that they fit very well as a duo, certainly offensively. We'll see, defensively, they have OG, they have Hart, they have, Bridges to kind of help those two in that regard. But offensively, they should be just a nightmare to deal with.
you may have touched on this already, talking about how much Karl cares about winning right now. Having covered him for his whole career, either as a person or a player or both, what do you think has been the biggest change from when he was drafted until now?
I just think that it's sort of an awareness of the outside noise around him, but not letting it derail him. Okay. I think he uses that more as not motivation. He's not putting, newspaper clippings on the wall or anything, but I do think that whereas earlier in his career, it was more of like a puzzlement of like, what's going on here? Why is this an issue? And now it's more of like, just, man, I got to shut that out. I got to block it out, and I've just got to play. And I think there's a real understanding, and he saw it last year when they had real success, how the narrative started to change around him, how certain people started to view him in a different light. And I think that there's just a fully understanding of, no, I can't, there's only so much I can say. There's only so much I can do other than win. And at the end of the day, if I don't win, that's going to be the thing that follows me. And so that's why he was so sort of open to having Rudy Gobert here. That's why he kind of accommodated Anthony Edwards the way that he did. That's why he did a lot of the things. That's why he switched positions, even though he was an all NBA center. He did all of that stuff just to kind of say, look, I got to do whatever I can do to make give me myself and this team the best chance to win. And that's the only thing that is going to change how I'm viewed as a player is, can I get a championship? Can I have real success in the playoffs? And he started to see that last year. And I think there's more of that. And maybe, year 3, year 4, year 5, maybe it was a little different view of the professional world.
If you take into account everything you just said and the fact that his career was progressing individually pretty nicely with the All-NBAs and the All-Stars, but not a lot of winning. And then he makes these changes. He makes these compromises. He plays second fiddle to Ant. He changes positions for Rudy. And now the team success has come, but he's like, the narrative hasn't really flipped with him. I'm wondering, it's, and you've covered this league for so long, so you know this better than anyone. I feel like it's rare for a guy to get to this point in his career where he's, starting his 3rd NBA contract. And it still feels like it's like a fork in the road, right? To me, it's not completely insane to think that something could happen in his career over the next 5-6 years where we're sitting around debating, in 22 years from now, is Karl-Anthony Towns one of the 100 greatest players who ever lived? It's also feasible for me to envision a scenario where no more All-Stars, no more All-NBAs, not a ton of success. So, what do you think will be the biggest deciding factor for him moving forward as to whether, and it may not have to do with him, it may not have to do with the surroundings, but what are you going to be keeping an eye on with him moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, what I think everyone wants to know sort of how he acclimates to New York. And given that he's a Jersey guy and Knicks fan growing up and all of that, you think match made in heaven. Great. That's awesome. But this is the Knicks and Madison Square Garden and Manhattan and all that is so different from Minnesota that it's impossible to even compare the two. I mean, what I would always say is there are going to be times where Cat does something on the court that you want to just shake your head at. You want to tear your hair out. There's going to be sometimes he says something kind of weird in a post-game interview or something, and you're just like, what is happening here? What is this? What's going on? And I think that he was in Minnesota so long, and we just got used to who he was, and we knew who he was as a person, that it was easier to sort of be like, that's just Cat. We're not, we're not going to belabor it. Whereas in New York, everything's going to be happening for the first time again. And I do sometimes think that, the big bad New York media is sometimes overstated. I think that, we can make a little too much of that, but I just know that there's a lot of them there, and there's going to be more scrutiny on every word. There's going to be, just a freshness of perspective in terms of looking at him for the first time that is both going to, I think, help him in terms of he's going to have big games, including, the other night. And you're going to be like, how is this guy not, just an all-star every single year? This guy's unbelievable. And then there's going to be other times where you'd be like, oh man, what's going on here? And so how he is able to digest and just focus is going to be key. And one of the things that I think helps him in that regard is, as he was leaving here, certainly with, he came to my daughter's soccer game and he was just showered with affection from fans. And I think that by and large, the outpouring of support and love's thrown his way from Minnesota fans who didn't always pour out that love and affection, I think maybe only reiterated that, Karl, like, if you just do what you just focus on the game, let that take care of itself, be as competitive and as focused as possible and win, you win the crowd. And so how all of that transition from the only place he's known professionally, the only press corps he's known professionally, all of that, to all the brand new and, navigating the highs and lows of it, I think that's going to be a real key into how quickly this becomes a successful venture.
Yeah, I think the first, the Knicks start off with 10 pretty difficult games. But I think the first month or two, I think if he starts out like Josh Hart came here and it was a world on fire. Mm-hmm. He was incredible. If he starts off good, then I think it'll make fans more amenable to looking past, if there's a first half that comes in, December or January and he gives his fourth foul in like 10 minutes or whatever, which I'm curious if that stuff is ever going to dissipate. I've kind of accepted as it's just part of his game at this point. Do you think that's always just going to be there?
Yeah, I there's nothing that I've seen so far that would say that it's going to turn over, except for, Jonathan, you like this, that the Minnesota fan base is convinced that now he's in New York, one of the flagship franchises of the NBA, that the refs are finally going to not be screwing him over the way that they did for 9 years in Minnesota. And so how that, if he turns into a guy who's only committing 2 fouls a game for the Knicks, there is going to be an uprising in Minnesota that is going to be difficult for the league to handle. I will tell you that. I'm
sure there is. I'm going to get you out of here, but before I do, I have to ask you just a couple quick ones about the two. I keep forgetting Keita Bates-Diop was part of this trade as well. All due respect to Keita, the two more notable new members of the Wolves. First, Randall, who's been, my God, if I had a nickel for every time I had a Julius Randle conversation, I would be a rich man. How do you see the relationship between him and the organization going from the perspective of I know Jaylen Brunson became the guy, but Julius was always still kind of the guy here because he was the first one, and that doesn't carry over necessarily with a trade. So obviously the contract situation, we know what that is. How do you see it going? What are you going to be looking for? What are you going to be paying attention to where that's concerned?
Yeah, just the similarities between Cat and Julius are just remarkable, really, when you look at it. Two guys who have been incredibly popular and with their fan bases, and then have had, kind of stretches where it's not, or two guys who have, struggled in the playoffs at times and feel like you have something to prove, but then you also look at their numbers and you're like, these guys are terrific players. What's happening? And then also similarly, whereas Cat goes into a locker room that's Jaylen Brunson's, Julius is coming into a locker room that's Anthony Edwards. And I do think that Ant does a very good job of empowering his teammates. There's very few guys that I've seen that really take people under their wing, deflect as much attention as possible to the other guys. And so I think Julius is going to be very happy with that pairing. And the other thing that works out well for him is he played for Chris Finch in New Orleans. And so there's familiarity there. And so I just think it's easier for Julius to come here and sort of dutifully play a different role than there was in New York. As great as Jaylen was, I would be hard pressed if I was Julius to be like, hey, I'm the guy that put this team back on the map. What's going on here? And so now he's come into a place where Anthony Edwards has the city in the palm of his hand. And I think that he will have to understand that his pathway toward another really gigantic contract, his pathway toward either stability here or elsewhere, is to play great team basketball and have a lot of success and be a complement to Anthony Edwards. If he shows that, then that takes care of everything. If he struggles with, another ball dominant player who has a high usage rate, and, is he getting his touches, and he's got to get his, so he can get his, his value up and things like that. That's going to be a harder thing for him to navigate. So you just definitely will be watching how the two of them just kind of mesh and what is feasible for him and where he's at in his career in terms of being able to share a spotlight and understand that he's as great as he has been as a player. There's nothing that he's going to be able to do to make him the number one guy here. Like that guy's Anthony Edwards.
Well, he seems to be excited about the food. So that's good, right?
Yeah. Yep. No,
now I want to go to Minnesota and try.
We see it all the time. I see it all the time. Everyone, Minnesota, the winters are so terrible and stuff. And then they come here when it's, in the summer or the fall. And it's like, you know what? This place is pretty nice. And we do have good food here, New Yorkers. Come on out. Give it a check. All right. Like we do have good food.
Last one. I'm going to ask you for a guess. This is just a guess. No reporting involved here. Who do you think closes more games this year? Donte DiVincenzo or Julius Randle?
Ooh, oh boy, that's a great question. I think early on, Finch is going to give Julius every single opportunity because I think that Finch really wants him to feel comfortable. I think he understands that a happy Julius really raises the ceiling on this team. But I think that as this thing evolves, we may see just how important DiVincenzo is because that floor spacing and that toughness that he brings on the perimeter is next level. And so I could see a scenario where it's, Donte, it's Edwards, maybe it's Conley, and then maybe it's, Jaden McDaniels at the 4 and Rudy at the 5. We'll see about that. They have a lot of options that they'll, I'm sure, certainly be playing with, but I think in their heart of hearts, they'd love it if Julius just becomes that guy and earns it, and he's going to get every chance to. But if not, the West is tough, man. They can't afford to drop too many games, so they'll have to be pretty diligent about making that decision.
I'm waiting for when there's expansion in a few years, the battle over which Western team gets to.
Oh man. We have our bags packed already. Like in this, I'm telling you, like there's been people in Minnesota have been talking about that forever. Put us with Chicago, put us with Detroit. Oh yeah. Because like the closest team in their division is Denver. And there's it's really hard to kind of forge rivalries with Portland and OKC and things like that. So if you can put them in with Chicago and Detroit and Milwaukee, people would be dancing the jig over here for sure.
I'm sure. Well, we'll get to that day when it comes. Jon Krawczynski, you are. I'll just say this: if you're a Knicks fan out there and you care even a little bit about Julius Randle or Donte DiVincenzo, and you want to keep up to tabs on what they're doing, you get to now have again. Fred Katz said it: the best beat writer in the business, covering any team in any sport. Writing about those guys and telling their stories as they continue their career with the Timberwolves. I can't wait to continue reading you this year and for as long as you want to do this, because you're just you're a delight, and happy to have you covering the league that I love. So thanks for coming on, giving us a few minutes. Appreciate it, man.
I appreciate it, Jonathan, and I'm actually happy for Knicks fans. Like I think like this deal will help them. I'm happy for Tibbs. I really have great affection for him.
Really? That's awesome.
Yeah,
I love
I do. Yeah,
I'm such a Tibbs guy.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. You're in the foxhole and it can be banging your head against the wall, but at the same time, like he treated everyone fairly when he was here. There was no favorites. That he never was disrespectful to us as media members. They were tense. There was tension. There was paranoia, things like that rippled through. But at the end of the day, I just really respected how he went about things that way. And then certainly afterward, I said no grudges. Like we've connected a few times, and
that's awesome.
He's like, I generally, I hope that he has success and that franchise has success with Cat now. So it'll be fun to watch.
Any and all Tom Thibodeau bouquets are welcome here on the Knicks Film School Podcast, where he is my shining light. Okay. Thanks for coming on, Jon. You're the best. Everybody out there, go please subscribe to The Athletic. They have many writers. Only one of them is Jon Krawczynski, but he's definitely as good as you will find on there. Thank you for coming on, man.
Absolutely.